If at any point you can't hear what's being said, just wave your hand, okay, and we'll fix it. Thank you for coming. I want to take a quick minute to thank Josh Lambier and the Words Fest team for organizing such an incredible event. It's been amazing. It's been incredible. There's been a breadth of talent over the last few days, and I think events like this are so vital to the community. They really enrich the community, especially just before a probably long, dark winter. Very well thought out, well considered, and at least from an outsider perspective, it seems to be flowing very well. So congrats to hear. So my name is Ruth Skinner. I'll be hosting today, and forgive me, I'm going to read a little bit from my iPad. I am what my Newfoundland peoples would call a come from away, but it didn't take me too long into arriving here a few years ago to realize what a phenomenon London regionalism truly is. There's nothing like it, and you know that I'm being serious because before moving here, I reserved that sentiment for anything Newfoundland related, because it's a thing that we do. I know that many of us here have personal lines of connection to regionalism. I've gotten to know it through my studies and through working in a hands-on way with organizations like Forest City Gallery, Museum London, the Macintosh, and other smaller artist-run spaces and galleries. There is, I think, a continuum connecting us directly with the beginnings of London regionalism. And so much of that continuum is constituted by the people who are present in this room right now, who have been part of that movement for decades. So getting to address you all here is truly an honor for me, the people in the audience, the esteemed community members here, and of course the panel members. So let's make sure this works. So the title of this panel is, of course, Revisiting Regionalism. London regionalism has been a presence throughout the entirety of Words Fest. I know a number of panels have tackled it head on in conversation, and visually it's the backdrop for the festival, that beautiful image that we keep seeing. It is the engine by which so much has already been said over the past few days, written about, created from. It is a constant humming, movement, a theme, question, belief, challenge, passion, way of being. Revisiting regionalism. So revisiting can signify a return to the familiar, pausing to spend time with the already known. It can also represent the opportunity to reconnect and reassess with fresh eyes, addressing what was previously unknown or unexplored, encouraging new narratives to emerge from that familiar and beloved movement, person, place, time. In whatever iteration, from whatever vantage point we choose to take, after 5 decades in dialogue with regionalism, it's clear that things are still very much evolving. So, to revisit with regionalism, we have 3 very exciting speakers. These women are all committed community members whose contributions represent a great deal to London and well beyond. How we're going to run this is I'll be introducing the speakers one by one. Everyone will be speaking for about 10 minutes. I may or may not wave frantically when your time is up. I'll have a question or two for the panel, and then I'd love to open it up to the audience. So with us today, we have Jamelie Hassan, Madeline Lennon, and Judith Rodger. So we'll begin with Judith Rodger, a freelance curator and art historian based here in London. She studied at McGill University, University of London, UK, Western University, and University of Toronto. She has worked at what we now know as Museum London, was formerly the London Regional Art Gallery, also at the Macintosh Gallery and at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Judith is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Visual Arts at Western. She's been involved in exhibitions of Greg Curno's work at Museum London and the AGO, and she has written extensively about him, Most recently, the book Greg Curnow, Life and Work, published by the Art Canada Institute. This is a beautiful publication. It's available for free online at their website, and there's also a gorgeous print book available for sale here today. And I'll remind you of that at the end, because I believe Judith will sign it if you would like. So please help me to welcome Judith.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Can you hear me at the back? Greg Curnow and regionalism. I'm going to start at the beginning, at the roots of regionalism. There. Where did London regionalism begin? It began in Greg Curnow's studios. He had 5 different studios in London. Here we see the artist in the first one, built with his father in the basement of the family home while he was a student at Beale. Notice the books behind him. He was an omnivorous reader and a writer as well as a visual artist. I mention that specifically because we're here for the Words Festival. Here is what his mother, Nellie, told me about this studio. Curnow's Inferno, somebody called it. There was a sign on the door. They all had all kinds of sessions down there. It wasn't just an art studio. A lot of young men, not just young men, a lot of people came. They gathered down there and had big discussions. There were people coming and going, running down my basement steps. I didn't know who they were. He made friends with everyone. They didn't have to be artists. And that sets the scene for what happened later. So Curnow returned from art school in Toronto in 1960. Within a few months, he had rented a studio on the 3rd floor of a building on Richmond Street at the foot of Carling. It's the 3rd floor above where David's Bistro is right now. I recall Don Vincent telling me what an impression this, renting a studio, made on other artists in London at the time. He said that he and most of the other artists were working in spaces in their homes. This and his subsequent studios at 202 King Street, which is across from Innovation Works, is now a parking lot, and 38 Weston Street became known as welcoming places. As John Boyle remembered, he renewed old friendships when he came back to London and sought out new people in the university and the community at large. His studio became a center of intellectual activity where ideas were discussed and plots were hatched. Greg Curnow was, without question, at the center of the art movement known as London Regionalism. In what he called the backwater of London, Ontario, and what Strand Dragland yesterday said was polite, prudish, and provincial, Greg's various studios were the gathering places for a group of artists who supported each other but developed distinct styles of their own. If they occasionally used the word regionalism, it was entirely without reference to other movements of that name around the world. The roots of London regionalism can be found in Curnow's desire to ground his art in authentic local culture, in his own daily encounters with his environment, rather than in the latest international trend. As he wrote, London's good artists demand to be looked at in their own terms. That they have reinforced one another doesn't mean that one artist can or should be examined as part of another artist's work. In other words, there was no London school, as you sometimes hear. Interestingly, London regionalism, the term, started in 1961 with a magazine, what we would now call a zine. Greg said, "Region came first. I forget how I arrived at the name, but Region magazine was started and published before the term regionalism was used or discussed here in London." He was the founding editor and publisher of Region magazine. There were 10 issues. You saw an image from the last one. The first issue is hand-typed in an edition of 5. The format is circular, it was about this big as I recall, and had 8 pages of poetry by Ken Montague, Greg Curnow, Donald Bruce Stewart, and Walter Redinger. In November 1962, Regent Gallery opens at 521 Richmond Street, just where the Black Trumpet restaurant is. There was an exhibition of works by Jack Chambers, Greg Curnow, Brian Dibb, Larry Russell, Tony Urquhart, Bernice Vincent, and Dawn Vincent. I want to move forward. I have one more picture, I think, here of this is an example of the parties that happened in the studios. This one happens to be at 202 King. And the photos, you'll notice I'm using a lot of photos from Dawn Vincent. We were really fortunate to have this archive of his works because he was there. He took pictures in the studio in the house on Langar Street. And all the way up, he documented what was going on, and they're wonderful photos. So I want to move forward to a story that happened in the fall of 1966. This story amazes me because it's something that simply wouldn't have happened now. Greg Curnow wrote to the curator of Canadian art at the National Gallery and said he thought it was time the National Gallery should buy one of his works for the collection. That was Greg. So what happens? The curator, whose name was Jean-René Ostegui, has a brand new assistant curator of Canadian art, and his name is Pierre Théberge. And he decided to send Pierre to London to take a look at Greg Curnow's work. This would not happen today. And I'm going to take the time, if you'll bear with me, to read Pierre's own words about this event. He said, "I had no idea who Greg Curnow was or even exactly where to find London on the map. I had never heard it spoken of as a center of creativity and knew only that it was the birthplace of Paul Peel, one of the most famous Canadian painters of his time. In fact, the only previous contact of any depth I had with contemporary Canadian art was through the Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal and that city's commercial galleries. I had only been to one artist studio, Guido Molinari's in Montreal, which I visited twice while at university on a student assignment. I walked to 202 King Street and climbed the stairs to his studio. Inside, I was immediately bewildered by the total disorder. Magazines, collages, assemblages, drawings, and all sorts of papers littered the tables. In the course of our conversations, I soon realized that Curnow was highly cultivated. He had the entire range of modern art history at his fingertips. As I was well acquainted with the number of his artistic and intellectual points of reference, our first contact was stimulating. Curnow also expressed curiosity about Quebec politics. Curnow invited me to come with him into a second room to get a large painting he had just finished. Together, we carried it out into the studio proper and set it up so we could view it more conveniently. I reacted with immediate enthusiasm to the colorful exuberance of the painting, the camouflage piano or French rondelles, and its simple, straightforward eloquence. I reserved the large painting for the National Gallery on the spot. Soon after, the painting entered the National Gallery collection. Curnow's painting and Guido Molinari's Black Angle from 1956 were among the first works I suggested for purchase. I still savor the pleasure I felt when my suggestions were approved by Mr. Ostegui, Jean Sutherland Boggs, the director at the time, and a majority of the committee. So I've taken the time because I think that is such an interesting story. It simply wouldn't happen today that you would have somebody hired at the National Gallery. He'd only been in one other artist studio to begin with. So that was 1966. In 1967, it was Western University English professor Ross Woodman who was the first to define the vibrant 1960s cultural scene in London, Ontario as Canadian regionalism. He described Curnow as a visionary who has shaped an authentic myth out of the stuff of his region. This was in Arts Canada magazine. Thebert's studio visit resulted in a key exhibition. Well, this is just to give you an idea of the painting that Curnow was doing in 1963. This is a wonderful self-portrait now in the Vancouver Art Gallery. Myself walking north in the tweed coat. And then this is the 2020 gallery, and I put this to show how community was working here. You have Bernice Vincent in the foreground, and Greg is in the middle. Sheila Curnow is standing, and then in the stroller is Charles Vincent, and on the floor is Owen Curnow. And if anybody knows who the man in the foreground is, we would all like to know, because... So I'm running out of time. The Heart of London exhibition was the result of Thebert's visit to London, primarily because Greg said he wanted to do an exhibition of Greg's work and Jack Chambers, because Greg took him to that studio. And Greg said, no, there are all these other artists. You have to come and see them. So there were 11 artists in this key exhibition, and the catalog was a comic book, which relates to Greg's interests, of course. Greg's interest in text goes back to his childhood when he was given a rubber stamp set, and he also was interested in cartoons. He says, it was natural for me to associate type and text with a picture. This is in the studio on Weston Street looking out at Victoria Hospital, and this is the first large text work. I'm going to leave that up for a second because this is huge. 6 panels in black and white with bright yellow frames. And you can get a sense of how big it is. That's Greg showing you how strong with what force he had to press each letter onto the canvas. So there are few works in his oeuvre that don't include text as in some form or another. And this is something that links Greg to Jamelie and also to Shelley Nero, who you're going to hear about from Madeline Lennon. Here's Jack Chambers and Greg in the studio at Weston Street, preparing to paint the Victoria Hospital paintings. This is the second one, and this was set up on one side, and Jack Chambers had his easel on the other side, painting his version of Victoria Hospital from a photograph that he took standing on the roof of Greg's studio. It shows you how everything is interrelated. So, sorry, I'm just skipping ahead here. These 2 works are important. These were among the last works that he did, the last major works. Deeds number 2 documents the period when his lot, sorry, I have to back up. In 1980, there was a dispute about where the lot line was between his property and his neighbors, and that led him to go to the registry office and start digging through deeds. Then in 1991, he started in again and created a series of works, 5 in all. This is number 2, where you see that it now belongs to Curnow. And then he started to wonder, who else lived on this property? So he started asking his historian friends, and everybody said, oh, we don't know anything beyond 1790. We just go back to settler history. And so Greg, being Greg, got busy and started doing a lot of research. And this is the result of his search that starts from 8,600 years before, I think, through the different cultures, down to Ojibwa number 2, which was the treaty that was signed by George III and gave the Crown all of southwestern Ontario, south of the Askunasippi, now the Thames River, on the east from Dorchester and Port Bruce, west to Lake St. Clair, on June 22nd, 1790. And Greg said, when I read a copy of that document, I began to be aware of spheres of influence that operated in this area in 1790. We live in a culture where pre-existing cultures lived and lived. They have survived in isolation from the culture of the City of London, both within the city and in areas of original settlement that date back to around 1690, 15 miles away. They've been omitted from most books of local history. The artist had extended his notion of regionalism from his backyard and the here and now to what had happened in this region for thousands of years. He said, "I have felt the power of many details adding up to an understanding of the ground I am standing on. It is an understanding that is new to me." We'll never know the full extent of the influence of Curno's talks and teachings, what the influence was on artists and students in Southwesto and across Canada. I'm going to mention just two today, but there were many others, some in the room. Jamelie Hassan first encountered Greg in art classes at H.B. Beale Technical and Commercial High School and eventually became a close friend. She has written, "Our experiences would also entail long hours of debate and argument against everything. Connecting people to each other and to ideas and to contemporary culture in Canada was central to maintaining a relationship with Greg Curno." In 1983, Curno wrote, "Work like Jamelie Hassan's is very much in the spirit of independent and specific activity for which all important cultures are known." Another artist who came within his orbit was Greg Hill. Greg was a student, first became aware of Greg, the two Gregs, of Curno, when he was a first-year fine arts student at Fanshawe College. He wrote, "He was the first professional artist I had ever heard speak. To say that I was inspired by what I heard would be an understatement. I was astounded. Here was an artist who did think interesting thoughts and expressed them both visually and orally in an engaging manner. He was likable. He dressed funny. I still remember the bright colors he wore that day, a yellow sweatshirt, a lime green shirt, and blue jeans. From his example, I took comfort in the notion of pride in place and self." Greg Hill is now the first Indigenous curator at the National Gallery of Canada. In 2007, he became the inaugural ordained curator of Indigenous art and head of the Department of Indigenous Art. In this role, he's connected to Shelley Nero and her works in the National Gallery. We're going to hear from Madeline about that. So to conclude, Greg Curno is still held in great esteem by a cross-section of the cultural community. In many ways, he was the heart of art in London. A natural and inclusive leader, he influenced his own generation of artists and the ones to follow by his decision to remain in London, close to his roots, creating art based on his own environment and experience. In other words, regionalism. Thank you. That's him in the studio at the very end. There we go.
Thank you, Judith. Whoop. Judith has set everything up so wonderfully, I can't get over it. Art and activism are intertwined in the life of Jamelie Hassan. One of 11 children of Lebanese immigrants, Jamelie grew up in an Arabic-speaking household here in London. She studied at the Academy of Fine Arts Rome, the École des Beaux-Arts in Beirut, Lebanon, the University of Windsor, and the University of Mustan, Syria, and Baghdad. Jamelie's travels contributed significantly to artistic development. A visit to Lebanon in 1967 confirmed her Lebanese cultural background. And in 1976-77, she was politicized by encountering post-colonial cultures in Central and South America. Jamelie began working full-time as an artist in 1972. Her art uses photography, text, and existing cultural artifacts to make cross-cultural references. It is both personal and political, addressing local and worldwide concerns about cultural interactions, the subjection of women, colonialism, racism, displacement, and political conflict. In 1983, she co-founded the London artist cooperative Embassy Cultural House and served on its board from 1985 to 1990. She is currently a guest professor at Western University's School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities. Please help me welcome Jamelie Hassan.
Thank you for that introduction. And again, I want to thank Josh Lambeye and the team for putting this together over a number of years. It's really added to the cultural life of London. Of course, it's a real pleasure to be here with my friends, many of you in the audience, but also on the panel, Judith, Madeline, and Ruth Skinner. Thank you so much. I would like to begin by asserting my view that London, Ontario is a place of radical histories. As we have heard from Judith, in the 1960s, the artists and the art public of London gathered around Regent Gallery on Richmond Street, and then Artist Run Gallery, 2020 Gallery on King Street. It seemed to me that these artists saw their relationship to their art practice and the community in London, Ontario, while they also had strong links nationally to other art centers such as Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Montreal, and Halifax, and not exclusively to their region. Other radical and formative discussions were also happening in London in this period. The professional status of Canadian artists was foremost in many artists' minds. These discussions resulted in the founding by Jack Chambers and a group of artists, including Greg Curnow, in London, of Canadian Artist Representation, or what we know now as CARFAC. And this was in 1968, so we are looking at more than 50 years of advocacy on behalf of artists. Looking beyond the regional of the Forest City, the collective programming that artists in London, Ontario, through artist-run centers like the Forest City Gallery, founded in 1973 and ongoing to the present, where Ruth most recently just completed her tenure as president at Forest City Gallery, and the Embassy Cultural House from 83 to 1990. These involve connections with artists regionally, nationally, and internationally. And what's on the screen here is the cover for the publication that was put together for the exchange project between London and Havana, Cuba. Going the right way? Yeah. So here is a group photo, which Judith had in her archives. Mine are a bit of a mess, I have to admit. So this was a project that involved Greg Curnow and Christopher Dudney, Ron Benner, myself, Fern Helfin, Murray Favreau, and Christopher Dudney wrote the text for the publication. It was only published in Spanish. Just to kind of also identify others in the group there, there's a translator and installer. Fern Helfin is there, who is standing beside Christopher Dudney, and the Canadian ambassador at the time in Havana, Cuba, was present at the opening of the event. There was a number of other Canadians there at that time because there was a Havana Film Festival that took place. So the actual kind of presence of Canadians in Havana at that time, we're talking 1988, was quite significant. So this kind of relationship between regionalism in London and the notion of regionalism within other communities was very profoundly felt by many of us when we were in Havana, especially since we're looking at a situation where Cuba was going through a blockade. So the fact that Canada had this relationship with Havana and Cuba in general was really outstanding. And our connection, I mean, you can fly from here. If you're in the US, you can fly from Canada to Havana. Christopher Dudney, speaking about the city and its identification with regionalism, he spoke extensively about the catalog, within the catalog, around his particular take on London. And this is actually a postcard from the Forest City Gallery where Christopher Dudney had done an exhibition. And as you can see, London is kind of like entwined by this cobweb. In modern times, he says, London has possessed an extraordinary cultural potency relative to its population. It has given rise to quite a unique nationally and internationally acclaimed artist. And the mechanism of this genesis is unknown at this point, but speculation has ranged from socio-economic reasons to mystical ideas centering on special geocentric force inherent in the physical location of the city. So if any of you were here for Walt Whitman and Buck's encounter, some of that cosmic consciousness obviously had an impact on Christopher Dudney. Dooney took this idea further in the catalog essay, pointing to, quote, the independent, which Judith referred to, this idea of the independent thinking of some London artists. Quote, artists in London have always been in a unique position of having enough geographic displacement from centers of power to enable them to maintain a critical retreat distance, and that the conservative nature of the city itself, it served to enhance their notion of otherness, and yet was somehow paradoxically nourishing. So the next image here is actually the famous map that Greg Cournot did. And it's interesting because Ron Benner and I were in Mexico at one point in Oaxaca, shortly after our loss of Greg Cournot. And we took this poster and made copies of it and plastered it all over Oaxaca. And what was interesting, that a lot of people from the US didn't realize there was something missing in the map. That is actually true. That's a true story. Okay. In April of 1998, I met Jason Dixon, a young writer and partner with writer Vanessa Brown of the bookstore Brown and Dixon. Jason asked for an interview. One of the striking coincidences was his interest in local archives, which coincided with some recent activity on my part with artist Ron Benner. We had, over the year of 1997, been spending time in the archives of the London Room of the Central Public Library, researching in particular the 1960s, the London of 2020 Gallery, Carr, Jack Chambers, Greg Cournot, reading back issues of 20 Cent magazine. And I mean, it was really interesting because Jason and other young artists and writers were referring back to 20 Cent magazine and the influence that that magazine had within the community at that time. And Jason took the term paradigm for his title of his journal, which was a play on this idea of 2 dimes, making 20 cents. I found myself reflecting on this situation that Jason's research and inquiry represented in relation to a younger generation of artists and writers who were energetically throwing themselves anew into London's culture, which of course is what we all need, is like another generation coming up and having that desire and enthusiasm. During the interview, this curiosity on the part of Jason specifically encouraged me to recount details of my childhood memories and influences. Last night, last night some of us were here for James Bartleman when he read from his book, Raising Wine, A Boyhood in a Different Muskoka. And he began his narrative from the perspective of his time when he was 10 years old. In the past, I've actually, I don't know why, but significantly, when I was 10 years old, that seemed to be a point of reference for me, when I became conscious of what it meant to be an artist. It was at that time that actually the Dooney family moved in across the street from our home on Erie Ave. We were at 26 Erie Ave, and they moved into 27 Erie Ave. Solomon and Irene Dooney, with their 4 sons, were hugely influential in many ways. I mean, very interdisciplinary and I've obviously referred to my friendship with Christopher, but I also had a really strong relationship with Solomon and Irene. And this actually is a watercolor that I did recently of the coves, because our house overlooked the coves. So when I wasn't wandering in the coves, as I was really kind of like a young environmentalist at that time, and Dooney was as well. So there was this kind of crossover where we would sometimes bump into each other. I don't know how kids were allowed to do what they were doing, but, you know, as Ruth said, I was a child of a family of 11, so they couldn't always keep their eyes on all of what we were doing. But among the intriguing visitors that would come to 27 Erie Ave was Greg Cournot, Jack and Olga Chambers, and Norval Morrisseau. So this is Namarin Center on Coburn Street. Many of you will recognize it. And Solomon Dooney and Norval Morrisseau, we know they're 2 minutes. Oh, sorry, my microphone. So Norval Morrisseau and Solomon Dooney became friends, and this has been acknowledged. But I mean, I think in terms of the fact that Solomon Dooney had this very early solidarity with Indigenous people has really not been emphasized as much as it should be. And their histories are indicative and evidence of the relationship. So this is I apologize for this photograph, but I just happened to see it when I was visiting Namarin recently. And it is a painting by Norval Morrisseau, which was actually sent to Solomon Dooney, and it was in his care to deliver to Namarin Center. I do remember that Norval Morrisseau actually came and stayed with the Dooney family as he was preparing for his exhibition. And in this photograph, you actually see Solomon is the far figure on the far side, Norval Morrisseau and Jack Pollock. Miriam Jordan Hallidan has done research on this painting, and she noted that on the back of the painting is the inscription that Solomon Dooney would, that it came within his care, but we aren't really sure what the story is behind it. I'd like to go further in that direction. I think it's very important. The Namarin Center celebrated more than 50 years as well. Dooney's petroglyph project collection is in the Royal Ontario Museum, which holds an extensive collection of his rock art studies. The Ojibwe Scrolls project collection is at the Glenbow Archives in Calgary. Early on in my life as a professional artist, I understood the potential of situating myself in a context locally, both in relation to London's history and geography. The concept of a region, a regional center, a place to work, a place of production, a place of dialogue, all these things came into play for me and personally appealed to me. Starting out in London as a young artist, I understood that you could support yourself one way or another and have a studio which you could afford. At that time, the formation of an organization like CAR was a powerful factor, both locally and nationally, and was another influence on me. Without that early work and determination of artists in London from 50 years ago, professional artists in Canada wouldn't have the advantages of the systems that we have today. Within the framework of regionalism, London artists have traveled and established links beyond the North American European context. And the Havana exhibition in 1988 is just one of many examples. Looking beyond the specific geographic space into other aspects of international programming, artists responded to important issues. Many international projects have linked London to the ideas of trans-regional, creating numerous situations to insert within the cultural landscape of London, Ontario, a significant questioning. In particular, the ethics of relationships to various and disparate communities has been central, such as our work with the Unity Project and Museum London's partnership with Up With Art, the annual fundraiser which raises funds towards supporting those who are homeless in London. By raising questions within everyday living, which includes a program that recognizes these earlier commitments and other questions of race and identity, the intersections of political, cultural, and environmental commitments to an art practice is perhaps what gives London, Ontario its significance and challenges an orthodox conservative impulse often associated with London, Ontario. Just and with just a couple of images, early images from the 1980 period, and this is one painting that is part of an installation called Common Knowledge. So the reference that Judith made to like text in its various ways in terms of my work. So that whole relationship to identity is in the context of coming from different backgrounds and how that was situated within the general kind of European-Canadian context of London, Ontario. So those are my parents, and the house represented in the drawing is actually my grandfather's house in the village of my mother. And then this is I wanted to show this because this is an installation of when the exhibition space, which is now the center at the Forks space, had this reflecting pool. And this is an installation from my survey exhibition that was hosted here in 1984. And if you go upstairs onto the second floor, there is one of these panels, and it's sitting beside Greg Cournot. Thank you.
I think for our AV buddies, this is starting to die on us. I am very loath to have to be the ding-dong to tell you guys to 2 minutes, because I could listen to you talk forever and continue to hear these lines of conversation and interconnection, but I do have to be that person. So we're going to end hearing from Madeline Lennon. Madeline is an art historian and curator working here in London. She earned her MA and PhD in art history, thank you, of the Renaissance and Baroque periods at the University of Toronto. In 1979, she began teaching at Western University, developing programs in visual arts and in comparative lit and culture. Madeline's teaching encompassed a broad swath of art history with a focus on the Baroque period. She has received university and national teaching awards, as well as the Distinguished Woman of the Year from the YMCA. She is now Professor Emerita at Western, having retired from the Visual Arts Department, but of course this gives her more time for studio visits and involvement with the art community. From her early days of teaching, Madeline interacted with young artist colleagues in visual arts who introduced her to the vibrant art scene in London, and she was invited to curate an exhibition of some of those artists' works at Mackintosh Gallery. That initial curatorial experience taught her the wonders of working with living artists as opposed to Baroque artists. Since then, she's written numerous essays for local and regional exhibitions. Her most recent publication is the book Shelley Nero, Seeing Through Memory with Blue Medium Press. And Jamelie mentioned Miriam Hallidan. That is, of course, the wonderful imprint by Julian and Miriam. And they have books available today. And again, we're going to make Madeline sign them if that is the will of the audience. So please help me in welcoming Madeline.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today with my friends. Shelley Nero and regionalism. Shelley is from our region, but she's from Brantford. I find in her work a parallel regionalism achieved from the perspective of Aboriginal people in Canada. She grew up on the Six Nations of the Grand River, a Mohawk or Iroquois of the Turtle Clan. As she puts it, they were dirt poor, though she and her 5 siblings did not know it at the time. The whole family was always busy making things. She especially loved drawing. Not surprising that she became an artist. Shelley has worked in many different media, from oil paint and watercolor to photography and film. My focus today is mainly on her early work in the 1990s, when she took life as she knew it as her subject and worked in photography. Going backwards, okay. So this is her mother, and the title is The Rebel. The Rebel dates from 1987, and it depicts her mother posing on the trunk of the family car. Her mother and 3 sisters all seem to enjoy posing and acting out positions of women as pictured within popular cultural entertainment, but they allowed their own personalities to shine through. I love this picture, so I had to start with it. In Shelley's work, she does use over and over again images that we recognize from popular media, magazines, TV, but she puts them into it, she and her family. And I think that says a lot about her work. In 1990, she responded to the ways in which natives were depicted in mass media and in scholarly studies, and the stereotypes imposed on natives. This led to a series that she titled the whole series Mohawks in Beehives. And all the photographs date from 1991. So this is an early example of Mohawks in Beehives, and it's her mother again, relaxing in her daughter's kitchen. This daughter became known as the hair sculptress. The title of this triptych is The Iroquois is a Highly Developed Matriarchal Society. Shelley was taken with the whole idea of how natives were seen by anthropologists, for example. She turned the ethnographer's dry, formulaic description on its head. What does it mean to live in a matriarchal society? It depends on your mother. Her mother clearly had a great sense of humor. But for Nero, the question about a matriarchal society rankled. Painfully aware of the dysfunctional family relationships and the mistreatment and dishonoring of women in native communities, Nero contemplated the role of women in Iroquois history and how colonization had destroyed the balance in many First Nations families. Originally, Iroquois women had control of their lives and equality with men in their community. While men traveled to trade and hunt, women remained with the longhouse, tending the crops, caring for the families, and organizing food and clothing. Among modern anthropologists, some have interpreted this organization as the subjugation of women, but this is a misinterpretation and a misunderstanding of the organization of this society. Traditionally, Mohawk women were seen as creators who understood the rhythms of nature and were entrusted with much of the organization and decision-making of the community. After marriage, the man lived with his wife's family. In this matrilineal society, their children became members of her clan. It was always the women who selected the leaders and who chose representatives to attend meetings with other nations. However, after contact, the European colonial authorities rejected any notion of a significant role for women and acted to undermine women's status by assigning titles and new roles to the men. This degrading of the fine balance in Mohawk life culminated more recently with the infamous residential school system that tore families apart, destroying languages and belief structures. In the face of this history, ethnographic studies of First Nations reads like accounts of a lost race. So Shelley talked to me at length about what happened to her in 1990 when there was that famous standoff in Oka, Quebec, with the natives protesting that their sacred grounds were being given over to a golf course. The city of Oka had decided this, and they took a stand. And Shelley says that it was like a last straw. Treaties had been undone across the nation, treaties that First Nations groups had with the Canadian government. And this was like the little explosion that went off. And she talked to me about how she was inundated with images on television and in newspapers that were constantly attacking Native peoples. In fact, I have to tell you that she still lives in Brantford today, and at one point she sent me, this was after we were working together, so more recently, she sent me a copy of the Brantford newspaper, and she said, read the editorial and understand why I just had to cancel my subscription. The paper was filled with racism against the natives. So it's something that she's lived with. But what was her reaction? I think it's just wonderful. It was this Mohawks and Beehives. So we saw just the picture of her mother. Here we see her three sisters. What she did was call up her sisters. They live on the reserve. She lives in the city of Brantford. And she said, get dressed up, do your hair. We are going out and we're going to have a good time, and I'm going to document it. And so we see her three sisters striking poses with their beehives. These date from 1990. And here they are. She did a series of these in red high-heeled shoes. These are photographs that she hand-colored, and she wrote on them in her own handwriting. And here it says, "We grow as maples, oaks, and pines along the banks of the Grand." The Grand River is a very important touchstone for Shelley Nero. And you can see how happy they are. I apologize, these slides aren't great. I have to say Shelley gave them to me, so there you go. And the interesting thing for me, I'm only showing you this one example, but there's a whole series of about 10 of these with her sisters just carrying on and having a great time in their red high heels. One of them is called Red Heels Hard. Well, they're standing in front of the monument in the center of Brantford to Joseph Brant, who was the founder and who was the one who was granted by the British Crown so much land, including both sides of the Grand River. And Shelley has told me hair-raising stories about people who just move into property that they decide no one owns and they build a house on it and then have rifles ready to challenge anyone who tries to cross their property. So this is ongoing life for them. Shelley did a number of portraits, and there is often text, but not always. She painted herself beautiful oil paintings in the woods, in the forest. This is her land, and she loves it. Now, this is a more recent triptych of photographs called Abnormally Aboriginal from 2013. 3 digital prints. And I'm going to read you, this is part of the book that I wrote with Shelley. There are different ways to convey the idea of strength. In Abnormally Aboriginal, Nero turns the camera on herself in a large-scale self-portrait representing 3 images of her across a black background. The detail in these portraits is almost brutal, her face seen very close up and filling the space. Her stern expression conveys serious concern. Beneath each image is a DNA strand, and for her, this recalls the pattern of the wampum, and she uses it in many other works as well. But here refers to DNA. There is a progression to these meditations on identity. In the first image, she wears glasses accompanied by the words abnormally aboriginal. In the second, she wears sunglasses accompanied by the words normal, original. In the third, she has no glasses, and there are no identifying words, except for the DNA strand. Nero's comment on this work is telling. While I was growing up, I was not aware of being an Aboriginal. We were Indians. As time went by, other words were added. Indigenous, Native, First Nations, and Aboriginal became the terms by which we were called and discussed. When I hear news coverage of Aboriginals now, it reminds me that others have imposed the name on us out of paternalism and misplaced sensitivity. Shelley Nero's regionalism gives us a vision of her life, her family, and their histories. Do you think I'm correct in noting a parallel with the work of Greg Curnow? Thank you.
We don't have a lot of time. Is it okay if we open it up to the audience? And then if nobody has a question. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, some of you probably. Hello? Oh, okay. Some of you might have heard that. I have a few questions on the back burner, but we don't have tons of time, and I would love to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions of the panel, if you have any. I'll do the 7 seconds of silence.
I think we want to hear your questions first.
I shouldn't have said it. I shouldn't have said anything. Okay. Okay, now I'll start with one. So I want to keep with our surroundings in relation to Words Fest and ask you three informally about the role publishing plays in the development of our understanding of regionalism. So over the decades, a number of communities of London artists have used publishing to converse about or challenge or cajole or just disseminate ideas of what regionalism means to them. And all three of you, of course, have been published pretty extensively on the topic through gallery catalogs, periodicals, and print imprints, publishers. So would you speak to how publishing and regionalism interrelate, whether from a historical vantage point or how that history might currently be being revisited in print? You have to use the microphone.
Fail. Technology 101. So, publication. I think it's true to say that if Greg Curnow had not documented his activities carefully, I often, when I was cataloging his archives, boxes and boxes of them, all put into file folders and organized by Greg, that I would not have been able to write what I've written about regionalism in London. So that was the beginning. He, of course, was very much involved in publication. We talked about Region magazine, 20 Cents magazine. He published all the time. He wrote letters to the editor across the country. He was very much involved in being part of a national discussion. Is that enough to say to begin with? Or I might just say right now a little plug for the Art Canada Institute, which some of you may not have heard of. It was started by Sarah Angel when she was doing her PhD at the University of Toronto and couldn't find good material for her teaching. So she started this project, which was always intended to be an online project. There are now over 30 books that have been published on Canadian artists that can be accessed by anyone free. And they have 1 million people have looked at this site from around the world. So I think it's a fabulous project. It's entirely her idea, and there was absolutely no government funding because it's not about contemporary art. But eventually, it will be useful for contemporary people down the road. So originally, my book was to be just an online publication, but last March, it was published as a hard copy because Sarah learned that people wanted to have the book in their hands. So now there are 4 that have been published, and there will be more each year, drawing from the ones that are online that you can all access. So I just wanted to say that. And it is really a labor of love because none of the authors get any royalties at all from the sale of these books. And Sarah keeps things going by fundraising like crazy to support the Art Canada Institute. So.
Maybe if you can answer in a minute or so, and then we're going to have to unfortunately wind down. But then you can find these speakers after the fact and ask all the questions I know that you are withholding.
And I think that's a really important point. I think that's a really important point that with art publications, people really do want the publication, the hard copy. And for all the projections that print publication, the book would be disappearing with the rise of online material. I think it's been proven that that's actually not the case, that people still love their books, and libraries are significantly important, not only for the holdings of publications and books, but also for the archive. And I think that's one of the big issues that many contemporary artists and the artist-run centers that are created by collectives is what happens to that archive. There actually right now is not a program to look at how to protect the archive, how to think about that archive, because more and more of our production and our thinking is held in that kind of print material. And certainly our generation, we're kind of a linking generation in terms of the transitions from the different technologies. And I do remember visiting Greg Curnow at one point when he was printing out reams and reams and reams of material out of his computer, and it was so bloody noisy. Remember that, Sheila? I mean, that machine, it was in that period of the early computer printouts, it was accompanied with this really horrible sound. And we had an international curator visiting who was sort of going around, Guy Brett, who was going around with Ron and I to visit artists here in London. And Greg wanted to give him this bunch of material, and he was printing it out. I mean, and so, I mean, the whole kind of studio experience was this relationship to the document and how important it is. So I think that's a whole other territory that I think institutions, educational institutions, granting bodies need to sort of pay attention to in terms of what's going to happen to the Artist Archive, because we all cannot protect our own archives. Institutions have a role to play in that.
I would just say one more word. Yes, thank you, Jamelie. It's such a fruitful area for research and writing, and there are all kinds of books being published, including one that Judith and I were both involved in called Reimagining Regionalism, edited by Joel Faflak and Skye Glabush. So really, it continues to inspire and affect people today. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for your attention, and help me thank everyone one more time.